write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. Behind the gilded walls of Topkapi Palace, a fear more potent than any army festered in the hearts of emperors. It was a silent, invisible killer served in a cup of sherbet or a dish of lamb. This is the story of the sultans who ruled the world but couldn't trust the food on their own table. We will uncover the whispers, the conspiracies, and the forensic evidence behind the poison murders that shaped the fate of an empire. How many padishahs were truly sent to their graves not by the sword, but by a single, treacherous drop? The Topkapi Palace. From the shores of the Bosphorus, it rises not as a mere residence, but as the heart of a world empire, a labyrinth of opulent courts, whispering fountains, and jewel-encrusted pavilions. For centuries, this was the center of power, the fulcrum upon which the fate of millions turned. But beneath the gleam of gold and the intricate patterns of Iznik tile, another, darker reality thrived. This was not just a palace, it was a gilded cage, and within its walls, the deadliest predator was not an invading army but a whisper, a rumor, a drop of colorless liquid in a cup of wine. The air itself was thick with paranoia. The Ottoman law of succession was a brutal calculus of survival. The concept of fratricide, sanctioned by Mehmed the Conqueror to prevent civil war, meant that a sultan's ascent to the throne was often paved with the bodies of his own brothers. Princes were raised in the cafes, a luxurious prison within the palace, knowing that their uncle or brother's reign meant their likely death. In this environment, where open violence was a messy affair, poison became the weapon of choice. It was the serpent's kiss, intimate, deniable, and terrifyingly efficient. It could be administered in a bowl of sherbet, infused into the fabric of a gifted caftan, or delivered on the tip of a physician's needle. It mimicked disease, turning suspicion into rumor and rumor into forgotten history. To counter this, the Sultan employed a chief taster, the çeşnigirbaşı, whose life was a testament to the sovereign's fear. Every dish was tested, every drink sipped by another first. But betrayal could come from anywhere. A trusted cook, a favored concubine, even a son grown impatient for power. The palace was a closed ecosystem of ambition, and poison was its silent language. The question that echoes down the centuries from these marbled halls is not simply who ruled, but who survived. How many padishahs, masters of the known world, met their end not to the roar of a cannon, but to the silent, creeping death that bloomed from a traitor's hand? Sultan Bayezid II was a man out of step with his lineage. Son of the conqueror of Constantinople, he was known as Bayezid the Pious, a ruler more captivated by mysticism, poetry, and architecture than by the relentless drumbeat of war. His reign was one of consolidation, not conquest, a period of calm that his youngest son, Selim, viewed with contemptuous impatience. Selim was his grandfather's echo, ruthless, ambitious, and forged for war. He saw his father's piety as a dangerous weakness, a rot at the core of an empire built on strength. The tension between them festered for years, finally erupting into open conflict. With the backing of the formidable Janissary Corps, who preferred a warrior sultan, Selim marched on Constantinople in 1512. He didn't just ask for the throne, he took it. Bayezid, old, exhausted, and defeated, was forced to abdicate. His only request was to be allowed to live out his final days in his birthplace of Demotica. Selim granted his father's wish. The old sultan's caravan departed from the capital, a somber procession marking the end of an era. But Bayezid would never reach his destination. Less than a month into his journey near the village of Hafsa, he died. The official chronicles state the cause was simply old age and failing health, a peaceful, if sad, end for a pious man. But the ink on these official accounts barely concealed the whispers that followed. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. A deposed sultan, even a frail one, could become a rallying point for dissent. As long as Bayezid lived, Selim's throne was not entirely secure. Later historians, writing with more freedom, would speak more openly of the dark rumors. They wrote of a physician in the caravan, a man loyal to the new sultan, who administered a fatal dose of poison. There is no definitive proof, no deathbed confession. There is only the damning circumstantial evidence, a ruthless son who seized power, and a father who died with convenient haste. The reign of Selim the Grim, one of the most consequential in Ottoman history, may have been founded upon the ultimate sin, patricide. There is a grim irony in history, a poetic justice that even sultans cannot escape. Selim I, the man who seized the throne from his father Bayezid II under a cloud of suspicion, was a force of nature. In just 8 years he crushed the Safavids, conquered the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and more than doubled the size of the Ottoman Empire. He was Yavuz, the Grim, or the Resolute, a name earned through blood and iron. He was a man of ceaseless campaigning and brutal efficiency, a lion who seemed destined to die in battle, roaring defiance at the world. Yet his end came not on the plains of Chaldiran or the sands of Egypt, but in a campaign tent in Thrace in 1520. The official story is mundane, almost insultingly so for such a monumental figure. The Sultan developed an anthrax pustule, a severe skin infection, on his thigh. For a man who had shrugged off battle wounds, it seemed a minor affliction. But it worsened. Fever set in. The infection spread to his bloodstream, and within weeks the conqueror of the East was dead from sepsis. A tragic but natural death. Or was it? Another narrative, one whispered in the corners of the court and recorded by chroniclers wary of the official version, tells a different story. This version centers on Selim's physician. In this telling, the physician was not a healer, but an assassin. Some sources suggest he was a Persian agent, seeking revenge for Selim's brutal persecution of the Shia Muslims. The story alleges that while treating the Sultan's ailment, the physician lanced the infected boil not with a clean blade, but with a poisoned one. A tiny scratch, a pinprick, introducing a lethal toxin directly into the Sultan's body. The poison would have mimicked the symptoms of sepsis perfectly, creating an undetectable murder, a perfect crime hidden within a plausible medical explanation. The irony is profound. Selim, the master of the sudden strike and the political gambit, may have been laid low by the one man he was forced to trust implicitly with his life. The lion of the empire, felled not by a sword, but by the subtle, treacherous sting of a physician's needle. Sometimes the most devastating poison isn't a substance, but a word. In the golden age of Suleiman the Magnificent, no star shone brighter than that of his firstborn son, Prince Mustafa. He was the empire's dream, a brilliant commander, adored by the Janissaries, and loved by the common people for his justice and charisma. He was the living embodiment of the Ottoman future, the heir apparent in every way that mattered. But within the gilded walls of the harem, another power was at work. Hürrem Sultan, Suleiman's legal wife, was a woman of formidable intelligence and boundless ambition, not for herself, but for her own sons. Mustafa, the son of Suleiman's first consort Mahidevran, was the one great obstacle standing in their way. And so began the slow, methodical poisoning of a father's mind. For years, Hürrem and her co-conspirator, the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, dripped venomous whispers into the Sultan's ear. They spoke of Mustafa's popularity with the army, framing it not as a strength for the empire, but as a threat to the throne. They intercepted letters, forged new ones, and created a tapestry of lies suggesting Mustafa was plotting with the Persian Shah to usurp his own father. Suleiman, aging and increasingly isolated by his own immense power, began to believe the lies. The poison took root. In 1553, he summoned Mustafa to his campaign tent in the Ereğli Valley. Despite grave warnings from his allies, Mustafa, confident in his innocence, obeyed his father's call. He entered the tent alone and was immediately seized by deaf-mute executioners and strangled with a bowstring as his father watched from behind a screen. But the story doesn't end there. Mustafa had a young son, a 7-year-old boy named Mehmed. He was the last of his line, a potential figurehead for any future rebellion. Shortly after Mustafa's execution, the boy was taken from his grieving mother in Bursa. He died soon after. While the official cause was given as illness, few historians doubt the truth. The child was quietly poisoned, a final, brutal act to extinguish Mustafa's legacy forever. The true tragedy is twofold. The poison of slander killed the empire's greatest hope, and the poison of a cup ensured he would never be avenged. In the gilded heart of the Ottoman Empire, power was not always wielded by the sword. Sometimes it was administered with a whisper, a rumor, a carefully placed lie that acted as a slow-acting poison on a man's reputation and, ultimately, his life. And no one understood this better than Hürrem Sultan, the woman known to the West as Roxolana. She transformed the imperial harem from a gilded cage into the empire's true center of political gravity. Her story is not one of overt assassination, but of a far more insidious form of elimination, a masterclass in political maneuvering that cleared the path for her own bloodline. Consider the fate of Shehzad Mustafa, Suleiman the Magnificent's firstborn son and the empire's brilliant heir. He was popular with the army, beloved by the people, a perfect successor. And to Roxolana, he was the single greatest obstacle to her own sons ascending the throne. The whispers began subtly. In the corridors of Topkapi, in the confidential reports to the Sultan, seeds of doubt were planted. Mustafa, it was said, was conspiring with the Safavids. He was growing too popular with the Janissaries, his ambition a threat to his own father. These were not accusations of treason. They were the political poison that eroded Suleiman's trust in his most beloved son. The architect of this campaign, working in concert with Roxolana, was the Grand Vizier, Rustem Pasha, who also happened to be her son-in-law. It was a web of family, ambition, and lethal insinuation. When Suleiman, convinced of his son's betrayal, summoned Mustafa to his tent and had him strangled, the poison had done its work. The throne was now within reach for Roxolana's less capable son, Selim. Roxolana never held a vial of arsenic, but with her network of spies, her influence over the Sultan, and her alliance with a powerful vizier, she administered a deadlier venom: paranoia. She proved that in the Topkapi Palace, one did not need to poison a man's food to destroy him, one only needed to poison his father's mind. Where the threat of poison is constant, the defense against it must become a sacred ritual. Within the sprawling kitchens of Topkapi Palace, an army of cooks prepared feasts fit for the ruler of the world. But between the simmering pots and the Sultan's private chambers stood a line of men whose job was the most trusted and the most terrifying in the empire. These were the imperial tasters, led by the çeşnigirbaşı, the chief taster of the Sultan. Their life was a daily dance with death. Every dish, from the simplest bowl of pilaf to the most elaborate roasted lamb, was prepared under the watchful eyes of the kitchen superintendents. Once ready, the food was placed in special dishes and sealed with the Sultan's personal seal. This was to prevent tampering during the long journey through the palace corridors to the imperial dining room. But the final, most critical test came at the Sultan's table. Before the Padishah took a single bite, the çeşnigirbaşı would step forward. With a silver fork, he would take a sample from every plate, a sip from every cup. He would chew, swallow, and wait. In that silence, the entire court held its breath. The taster was not merely checking for flavor, he was a human shield, the first line of defense against the assassin's deadliest tool. If the food was tainted, he would be the first to sicken, the first to die, his own body the final, desperate alarm bell. The paranoia was so ingrained that the palace even employed special porcelain from China, celadon ware, rumored to change color or crack if it came into contact with poison. Every meal was a ceremony of suspicion, a testament to the Sultan's isolation. The men who tasted his food were more than servants. They were living sacrifices, a constant breathing reminder that the hand that serves you could just as easily be the hand that seeks to kill you. To be Sultan was to be the shadow of God on earth, an absolute monarch whose every whim was law. Yet it was also to be the most isolated and vulnerable man alive, a prisoner in a palace of his own making. The constant, gnawing fear of poison did more than just dictate dining rituals. It seeped into the very soul of the ruler, warping his judgment and corroding his sanity. Imagine sitting down to every meal, looking into the faces of your most trusted servants, your advisors, even your own family, and wondering which of them might wish you dead. This was the daily reality for the Sultan. This psychological venom bred a profound and debilitating paranoia. It explains the evolution of the palace itself, with its labyrinthine corridors, hidden chambers, and the secluded quarters of the harem, designed not just for privacy, but for security. Trust was a currency more valuable than gold, and infinitely rarer. This fear fueled the brutal tradition of fratricide. Why wait for your brother to poison you when the law of the land, for a time, permitted you to eliminate him as a potential rival upon your ascension? It was a cold, cruel calculus born of the terror that a shared bloodline was no defense against the thirst for power. Some sultans succumbed entirely. Ibrahim I, known as the Mad, spent his formative years locked in the cafes, or the cage, a gilded prison within the palace, constantly fearing his brother Murad IV would order his execution. When he finally emerged as Sultan, his mind was shattered. His erratic behavior, his violent outbursts, and his deep-seated paranoia were the tragic legacy of a life lived in the shadow of assassination. The Sultan was master of all he surveyed, but he was master of nothing when it came to the fear in his own heart. He could command armies and topple kingdoms, but he could never be certain that the next spoonful of honey wasn't laced with his own death. Not all threats came from ambitious brothers or scheming consorts. Sometimes the poison was brewed by the very institutions sworn to protect the throne. Such was the tragic fate of Osman II, a young, intelligent, and dangerously ambitious sultan who saw the rot at the core of his empire and dared to try and cut it out. Ascending the throne as a teenager, Osman recognized that the once feared Janissary corps had become a corrupt and lazy political body, a state within a state that bled the treasury and threatened the Sultan's authority. He planned a radical overhaul, to shut down their coffee houses which had become centers of dissent, to slash their pay, and to raise a new, loyal army of Anatolian Turks to replace them. He was a reformer, a visionary, and in the eyes of the establishment, that made him a dead man. The conspiracy against him was swift and brutal. The Janissaries, incited by their commanders and allied with powerful figures in the court who felt threatened by Osman's reforms, rose in revolt. They stormed the palace, a tide of rebellion that the young sultan could not contain. While history records that Osman II was ultimately deposed and brutally strangled in the dungeons of Yedikul Fortress, the first regicide in Ottoman history, whispers have always persisted about the role of poison in his downfall. Some accounts suggest that before he was captured, an attempt was made to incapacitate him with a drugged or poisoned meal. The goal may not have been to kill him outright, but to weaken him, to make him an easier target for the mob. Whether it succeeded or not, the story serves as a potent symbol. Osman's fatal meal was not just a potential bowl of food, but his entire reform agenda. He tried to force-feed a bitter medicine to an empire that refused to swallow it. In return, the old guard served him a dish of betrayal and rebellion. His murder was a chilling message to all future sultans. The empire would devour any ruler who dared to change it too much, too fast. The ascent of Ibrahim in 1640 was not a moment of triumph, but one of profound terror. For years he had languished in the gilded prison of the cafes, listening as the silken cord of the executioner silenced his brothers one by one on the orders of the formidable Murad IV. When the palace officials came for him, Ibrahim barricaded the door, convinced his own death had arrived. It was only when they presented the corpse of his brother Murad that he believed he was sultan. But the man who emerged from the shadows was broken. His mind, fractured by years of isolation and fear, became the new battleground for the empire. His reign began as a dark carnival of excess. He developed bizarre obsessions, demanding his palaces be lined with sable fur and showering his favored concubines with jewels. He famously became infatuated with corpulent women, sending his agents across the empire to find the heaviest woman imaginable. While these stories are often dismissed as eccentricities, they reveal a psyche dangerously untethered from reality, a vacuum of authority that his mother, the ever-present Kösem Sultan, was more than willing to fill. The intrigue around Ibrahim was a slow-acting poison in itself. Did anyone need to slip a physical toxin into his food when his mind was already so susceptible to manipulation? Factions within the court, led by ambitious viziers and rival women of the harem, played on his paranoia and preyed on his delusions. They whispered suggestions that fed his worst impulses, isolating him further from the levers of state. His rages were unpredictable, his decrees nonsensical. He ordered the drowning of his entire harem of nearly 300 women on a whim, based on a single rumor. This instability made him a liability. The question is not whether Ibrahim was murdered by poison, but whether his entire reign was a state of being poisoned by power, fear, and the relentless machinations of those who saw his madness as their ultimate opportunity. His eventual deposition and strangulation were merely the final, merciful symptoms of a long and fatal sickness of the soul. If Ibrahim was the puppet, Kösem Sultan was the undisputed master. Her story is a testament to the terrifying heights a woman could achieve within the Ottoman patriarchy, and the brutal depths she would plumb to stay there. Having guided the empire as regent for her son Murad IV and then manipulated it through the madness of Ibrahim, she was not prepared to relinquish power. When Ibrahim was deposed and executed, a pact she herself sanctioned, her 7-year-old grandson Mehmed IV ascended the throne. This should have secured her position as Valid Sultan and regent once more. But there was a new power player, the boy's mother, Turhan Hatice Sultan. The court split into two venomous factions. On one side was the old guard, loyal to the experienced and ruthless Kösem. On the other, a new generation of officials who saw their future with the young and ambitious Turhan. The Topkapi Palace became a nest of vipers. Kösem, feeling her grip slip for the first time in decades, made a fatal miscalculation. She plotted to remove her own grandson. The plan was audacious and chilling. She would have the young Sultan Mehmed IV poisoned. Some sources suggest the poison was to be slipped into his nightly sherbet. In his place, she would install another grandson, Suleiman, whose mother was a far more pliable ally. The plot was a declaration of war within the dynasty's heart, but Turhan was not idle. She was warned of the conspiracy by one of Kösem's own slaves. The countermove was swift and merciless. On the night of September 2, 1651, Turhan's loyalists, led by the chief black eunuch, stormed Kösem's chambers. The most powerful woman in Ottoman history was found hiding in a chest. She was dragged out, her jewels and clothes ripped from her and strangled with a curtain cord. Her death marked the end of an era. The matriarch who had navigated decades of political poison, who had wielded it as a tool of statecraft, was ultimately consumed by the very game she had mastered. In the perfumed halls of Topkapi, where a sultan's life was the empire's most valuable and vulnerable asset, one man walked a razor's edge between salvation and damnation, the çeşnigirbaşı, the chief physician. This was not merely a doctor, but a confidant, a scientist, and, potentially, a kingmaker or an assassin. The çeşnigirbaşı was often a man of immense learning, drawn from the diverse intellectual pools of the empire, a Sephardic Jew from Salonika, an Armenian from Anatolia, a Persian scholar of Avicenna. He commanded a vast knowledge of Galenic humors, astrology, and the burgeoning science of pharmacology. His duty was to preserve the sacred life of the padishah, to concoct remedies for his ailments, to balance his humors, and to ensure the continuation of the dynasty. Yet this sacred trust was also a terrible weapon. Every potion, every poultice, every dietary recommendation carried with it the potential for treachery. A powerful Grand Vizier, desperate to remove a sultan who favored a rival, could corner the physician. A Valid sultan, eager to place her own son on the throne, could make an offer the çeşnigirbaşı could not refuse. The choice was stark. Administer a slow-acting poison and be rewarded with riches and influence, or refuse and find yourself accused of the very treason you sought to avoid, your own life forfeit. The pharmacopoeia of the era was a murderer's garden. Arsenic, the inheritance powder, could mimic the symptoms of cholera. Aconite or wolfsbane could induce a heart attack that appeared natural. Belladonna, mercury, and lead compounds could be administered over weeks or months, leading to a slow, agonizing decline that baffled all but the one who administered it. The physician's notes would speak of melancholy, of an imbalance of black bile, while the true cause was the steady drip of poison in the sultan's wine. How many sultans who died of a lingering illness or a sudden fever were actually victims of their own healer? The physician's oath, sworn to Apollo and Asclepius, was a fragile shield against the brutal realities of power at the Sublime Porte. Beyond the internal rivalries of the harem and the divan, the walls of Topkapi Palace concealed another, more silent war. This was a war fought not with armies, but with whispers, secrets, and powders, the clandestine conflict of international espionage. For the great powers of Europe and the East, Venice, the Habsburgs, France, Safavid Persia, the Ottoman court was the ultimate prize. To have influence over the Sultan was to control the arteries of global trade and the balance of military power. And the swiftest path to influence was often assassination. Foreign ambassadors were more than diplomats. They were spy masters. Their retinues included agents skilled in deception and, when necessary, elimination. Poison was their preferred weapon. It was deniable, difficult to trace, and created chaos and succession crises that could be exploited. The methods were as ingenious as they were deadly. A Venetian agent, posing as a Genoese merchant, might present the Sultan with a magnificent velvet robe, its collar and cuffs subtly dusted with a contact poison that would be absorbed through the skin over days. A Persian envoy, seeking to weaken the Ottomans before a campaign, could offer a gift of exotic spices for the palace kitchens, with one jar containing a finely ground, tasteless poison destined for the Sultan's pilaf. The paranoia this engendered was all-encompassing. The position of çeşnigirbaşı, the chief taster, was one of the most critical in the palace. Every dish prepared for the Sultan was first sampled by this official, but this was a flawed defense. A taster could be bribed or blackmailed. More importantly, they were helpless against the new generation of slow-acting poisons developed in the apothecaries of Italy and beyond, toxins that would show no immediate effect. The empire's own intelligence network, a web of agents stretching from the Balkans to the Indian Ocean, worked tirelessly to uncover these plots. They intercepted letters, tortured suspected spies, and monitored every foreigner in Istanbul. Topkapi was a fortress, but it was under permanent siege. Every ornate gift, every foreign visitor, every new addition to the harem was a potential vector for a hostile power's deadliest intentions, turning the splendor of the court into a gilded cage of suspicion and fear. By the dawn of the 18th century, the methods of murder in Topkapi Palace were becoming antiquated. The silken bowstring, the dagger in the dark, the crushed diamonds in a sorbet. These were brutal, often messy affairs. They spoke of raw power, of physical dominance. But as the Ottoman Empire's gaze turned increasingly westward, it imported more than just tulips and printing presses. It imported a new, more insidious form of death. From the labyrinthine courts of Renaissance Italy and the gilded salons of France came a whisper, a powder, a revolution in toxicology. It was called l'acqua tofana by some, poudre de succession, the inheritance powder, by others. But its primary agent was known by a simpler, more chilling name: arsenic. Tasteless, odorless, colorless when dissolved, arsenic was the perfect instrument for a court built on layers of paranoia. It was a ghost that could kill. Unlike the poisons of the East, which often produced violent, telltale convulsions, arsenic poisoning was a masterpiece of deception. Its symptoms, agonizing stomach cramps, vomiting, a burning thirst, mimicked cholera or dysentery with terrifying accuracy. A sultan could be dying from a dose administered by a trusted concubine, and his physicians would diagnose a common, if fatal, stomach ailment. This new weapon shifted the balance of power within the palace walls. It was no longer just the domain of the powerful vizier or the brutish executioner. Now, a slighted wife, a patient prince in the cafes, or a foreign ambassador could deliver a death sentence in a cup of coffee, a bowl of soup, a piece of locum. The fear was no longer of the assassin you could see, but the one you couldn't. Every meal became a potential execution, every servant a possible agent of death. The arsenic age had arrived in Istanbul, and it would turn the already deadly game of succession into a silent, invisible war. Not all poisons that felled a sultan were chemical. Some were brewed in the streets, distilled from the anger of the masses and the resentment of the military. Sultan Ahmed III presided over one of the most culturally dazzling periods in Ottoman history, the Lale Devri, the Tulip Era. For years, the Bosphorus shores were alight with opulent palaces, moonlit poetry readings, and extravagant tulip festivals. The court embraced European art, architecture, and fashion, creating a delicate, hedonistic world of immense beauty. But this beauty was a fragile veneer. While the elite indulged in breathtaking excess at the Sadabad Palace, the empire's treasury was draining, its military was neglected, and the common people faced economic hardship. The poison of discontent began to spread. It was a slow-acting toxin, seeping through the coffee houses and barracks of Istanbul. The Janissaries, the once feared fist of the empire, saw this cultural shift as a sign of weakness, of a sultan who preferred poetry to conquest. In 1730, the poison reached its fatal concentration. Led by an Albanian janissary named Patrona Halil, a furious mob rose up, their rage a firestorm against the perceived decadence of the sultan. They were not armed with arsenic, but with torches and grievances. The rebellion was the poison that paralyzed the state. For Ahmed III, trapped behind the palace walls, the choice was stark. He could fight and risk the complete destruction of his dynasty, or he could succumb. The threat of a physical death, by sword or bowstring, was palpable, but the political poison had already done its work. He was forced to abdicate, sacrificing his Grand Vizier and other officials to the mob before handing the throne to his nephew, Mahmud I. Ahmed III was not killed by a drop of venom, but by a tidal wave of popular fury. He was sent to the cafes, the gilded cage he had left decades before, to live out his days as a prisoner, a living testament to how a reign can be poisoned not from within the palace, but from the world just outside its gates. In the heart of Topkapi, the Sultan's life was a paradox of power and vulnerability. He was the shadow of God on earth, yet his mortal body was susceptible to the same fevers and frailties as any commoner, and, of course, to poison. To protect this sacred life, the court sought the best medical minds available. Increasingly, these minds belonged to foreigners. European physicians, particularly from Venice and France, were prized for their knowledge of anatomy, surgery, and pharmacology, which often surpassed that of their Ottoman counterparts. Yet, inviting a foreign doctor into the Sultan's private chambers was a profound gamble. This individual, this Frank, was given the ultimate access. He could touch the Sultan, administer medicines, and hold the imperial life in his hands. He was both the ultimate protector and the most terrifying potential assassin. The figure of the Venetian doctor became a symbol of this deadly dilemma. Venice was a rival, a trading partner, and a nest of spies. Was the doctor sent to Istanbul to cure the Sultan's ailments, or to serve the interests of the Doge? Was the potion he prescribed a remedy, or a slow-acting poison, designed to weaken the Sultan over months, to create instability that Venice could exploit? Every diagnosis was scrutinized, every prescription questioned. A successful cure could bring immense wealth and influence. But if the Sultan's health worsened after treatment, suspicion would fall immediately. The doctor walked a razor's edge. He had to navigate not only the complexities of medicine, but also the treacherous currents of court politics. A rival vizier might bribe him to harm the Sultan, or frame him for it if he refused. The foreign doctor was a necessary evil, a repository of trust in a place where trust was the rarest commodity. His loyalty was never certain, and in his medical bag the line between a cure and a curse was terrifyingly thin. Sultan Mahmud I, the man who rose to power on the ashes of the Tulip era, was a survivor. He had navigated the treacherous aftermath of the Patrona Halil rebellion, ruled for a successful 24 years, and deftly managed wars with Austria, Russia, and Persia. He was a seasoned, intelligent ruler who understood the dangers that lurked in every shadow of his palace. Yet his end came not in the chaos of battle or in a silken bed, but with shocking abruptness on a cold Friday in December 1754. The official account is simple, almost mundane. The 58-year-old Sultan, who had been in declining health, insisted on attending the Friday prayer at a mosque outside the palace. The service was long, the air was frigid. As he rode his horse back towards the Topkapi gates, he slumped forward in the saddle. His attendants rushed to his side, but it was too late. He was dead before they could get him back inside. The cause was declared to be a stroke or a heart attack, a natural, if sudden, end. But in the Ottoman court, nothing was ever that simple. The speed of his death was suspicious. Could a fast-acting poison have been administered just before or after the prayer? Its effects timed to strike when he was in public, creating the appearance of natural causes. The question of motive pointed directly to one man, his younger half-brother, Osman. For 51 years, Osman had languished in the cafes. 51 years of isolation, of watching his brother rule, of nurturing a bitterness that must have curdled into a deep and abiding hatred. Upon Mahmud's death, Osman III took the throne. His short reign was marked by cruelty and eccentricity, the behavior of a man warped by a lifetime of imprisonment. Did he finally find an ally, a physician, a servant, to deliver a fatal dose to the brother who held him captive for half a century? Mahmud I's final ride remains one of the great historical mysteries. Was it the hand of God, or the culmination of a 50-year-old grudge delivered in a final, lethal act of poison? By 1876, the winds of change were a hurricane battering the ancient walls of the Ottoman Empire. At their center was Sultan Abdulaziz, a ruler seen by a new generation of Western-educated ministers as an obstacle to progress. Led by the formidable Midhat Pasha, a conspiracy of state officials moved against him. On the 30th of May, the Sultan was deposed in a swift, bloodless coup, his 3 decades on the throne ending not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of palace doors. He was confined to the Fairy Palace, a former sovereign now a prisoner, his fate hanging in the balance. Just 5 days later, he was found dead. The official narrative was swift and decisive. Suicide. The Sultan, despondent over his fall from grace, had supposedly asked for a pair of scissors to trim his beard and used them to sever the arteries in his wrists. But the story felt hollow, theatrical. Could a man of Abdulaziz's immense physical strength and pride be overcome so easily? How could he inflict such fatal symmetrical wounds on both arms with a simple pair of scissors? The whispers began immediately. This was no suicide. This was murder, a political execution to prevent any chance of a counter-coup. The new Sultan, Murad V, was already showing signs of mental instability, and the conspirators could not risk a popular movement demanding Abdulaziz's restoration. His death was too convenient, too neat. Years later, his successor and nephew, Abdulhamid II, would stage a show trial, convicting Midhat Pasha and others of the murder. But was this justice, or was it Abdulhamid cynically eliminating his own political rivals under the guise of avenging his uncle? The truth of Abdulaziz's final moments remains one of the dynasty's great mysteries. Was he murdered outright, or was he perhaps drugged, weakened by poison, and then coerced into a staged suicide? His death marked a brutal end to an era, a final, bloody exclamation point on the long history of palace intrigue, proving that even in the modern age, the old, dark methods of securing power had not been forgotten. Sultan Abdulhamid II ascended to a throne stained with blood and suspicion. He had witnessed the violent deposition of his uncle Abdulaziz and the swift mental collapse of his brother Murad V. These events did not just inform his reign. They forged it in a crucible of deep, unshakable paranoia. He understood, perhaps better than any sultan before him, that the greatest threat was not a foreign army, but a disloyal servant with a vial of poison. His response was to transform the seat of power into a fortress of fear. Abandoning the sea-facing Dolmabahce Palace, he retreated to the secluded, defensible heights of Yıldız Palace. A sprawling complex of villas and gardens he turned into a labyrinthine prison of his own design. From here, he governed through a web of terror and intelligence. His network of spies, the Hafiz, was legendary, infiltrating every corner of the empire and the court itself. No one was trusted. Every conversation was potentially overheard. Every loyalty was suspect. But his most elaborate defenses were reserved for the threat of poison. The palace kitchen, the kushane, became a hermetically sealed laboratory. Every dish was prepared under guard and placed in locked containers, the keys held by only the most trusted officials. Before any morsel touched the Sultan's lips, it was tested by royal chemists. He often employed food tasters, and it's said that even palace cats were sometimes used as a final, desperate line of defense. He rarely drank from a communal source, having his own water brought from a specific spring he deemed safe. He was a prisoner of his own precautions, an emperor living in self-imposed solitary confinement. This obsessive fear was not merely a personal affliction, it was an instrument of rule. The Red Sultan, as his enemies called him, used the fear that consumed him to control others, creating a state where the whisper of conspiracy was enough to mean death or exile. He survived for 33 years, outlasting his enemies through sheer, meticulous caution. He had learned the ultimate lesson of Topkapi. Absolute power requires absolute suspicion. For centuries, the question of poison has been trapped in the pages of biased chronicles and the whispers of palace gossip. But what if we could ask the dead themselves? In the modern age, a new discipline has emerged: forensic history. It promises to cut through the layers of propaganda and speculation with the cold, hard scalpel of science. The greatest challenge, of course, is time. Most organic poisons, the hemlocks, the nightshades, the countless plant-based concoctions of Ottoman physicians, degrade and vanish, leaving no trace for our instruments to find. But the poisoner's other favorites, the heavy metals, are a different story. Arsenic, antimony, and mercury are the forensic historian's closest allies. These elements don't easily decay. They can bind to the body's keratin-rich tissues, hair, and fingernails, and integrate into the very structure of bone. There, they can remain for centuries, a silent, elemental witness to a crime. The process is a marvel of modern analysis. Using techniques like mass spectrometry, scientists can detect trace amounts of these substances, measuring them in parts per million. This has allowed us to re-examine famous deaths, from Napoleon's potential arsenic exposure on St. Helena to the mercury levels in the remains of the astronomer Tycho Brahe. Could these same methods unlock the secrets of the Sultans? The potential is tantalizing. Imagine an analysis of the remains of Fatih the Conqueror, whose sudden death has long been attributed to a poison plot, or examining the bones of Bayezid II for the telltale signs of arsenic. However, the path is fraught with difficulty. Exhuming the body of a sultan, a figure considered the Caliph of Islam, is a matter of immense religious and political sensitivity. Furthermore, a positive result isn't always a smoking gun. Arsenic was a common ingredient in Ottoman medicine and even cosmetics. The key is in the dosage and distribution, distinguishing between a lifetime of low-level exposure and a single, massive, fatal dose. Science offers a glimmer of truth, a chance to hold a real inquest for these imperial cold cases. It gives us the tools to finally confirm or deny the whispers that have echoed from Topkapi for half a millennium. So, how many sultans were really poisoned? The honest answer is that we will never know for certain. The official records are instruments of statecraft, not objective truth. When a sultan died, the declaration of natural causes was a political necessity, designed to ensure a smooth transition of power and project an image of divine sanction. The real history was not written in ink. It was carried on the wind, in the hushed conversations of courtiers and the coded dispatches of foreign ambassadors. The truth lies not in a single document, but in the overwhelming pattern of events, in the culture of fear that permeated the dynasty. The paranoia of a ruler like Abdul Hamid II is, in itself, a more powerful piece of evidence than any single chronicle. It is the testimony of a man who knew the system from the inside, who understood that the gilded cage of the Sultanate was also a death trap. The great unsolved cases remain suspended in history. Was Fatih Mehmet II, the conqueror of Constantinople, felled by a physician's poison on behalf of Venice? Did Selim the Grim truly poison his own father, Bayezid II, to seize the throne he craved? Was the suicide of Abdulaziz a carefully orchestrated murder to usher in a new political era? These are not simply historical riddles. The constant, looming threat of assassination by poison was a defining force in Ottoman history. It shaped the brutal law of fratricide, where a new sultan would kill his brothers to eliminate rivals. It influenced the very architecture of the palaces, with their secluded chambers and guarded kitchens. Power in the Ottoman Empire was absolute, but it was also terrifyingly fragile. The Sultan could command armies and rule over continents, yet his life could be extinguished by a pinch of powder in his coffee, administered by a hand he trusted. The poisons themselves may have vanished into the soil, the evidence degraded by time. But the legacy they created, a legacy of suspicion, fratricide, and all-consuming fear, is the dynasty's most enduring and tragic inheritance. The whispers of Topkapi have never truly been silenced.